Good evening. My goodness, people are leaving before I even start. It's quite a task to be a keynote speaker at this time of the evening. I was told I could speak for an hour. What I suspect is that you all don't want to hear an hour. So what I'll do is keep an eye on all of you and try to cut it off when I see that you're starting to run out of steam. For those of you who may be wondering, one day I was driving along, minding my own business, and a drunk driver went through a stop sign. And that is what has put me in this chair. I'm going to start this evening with a once upon a time story. And I know that's really tempting at this time of night. But fortunately, my hearing is very good, and I will hear any snores, and I'm going to be watching for people's bodies nodding, and that includes friends and new friends at my table, and I'll settle you out. Be warned. Okay. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, a biracial child was born in Montreal, Quebec. In those days, people did not get together across races. And the children's agency that was given her had this child in their hands and said, what are we going to do with her? She's not this color, she's not that color. Who's going to want her? Well, as luck or fate would have it, they found a woman who was dying of cancer, who was married to a black man. And they loaned little Jane to this woman who was dying. That was not a slip of the tongue. They loaned her because the woman was only to live for 6 months. Well, the woman was extremely ill, and she was in and out of the hospital, and little Jane was in and out of foster care. Not the greatest start for a little human being. But the woman lived until Jane was a year old, and the Children's Agency renewed the loan. And then little Jane turned 3 years old, and they renewed the loan again. And by this time, her mother was saying, what's the matter? I love little Jane. Why can't I adopt her? And now this was a very long time ago, and at that time, people weren't told you're going to die. So they allowed her to adopt that little girl. And when little Jane was 7 years old, cancer did what it often does, and it took her mother's life. Now, I don't know how some people deal with death, but for little Jane, she thought, one day my mommy's going to come back, and everything's going to be okay. Well, that didn't happen. No surprise to any of us here. Little Jane's father, the man who had adopted her, had a girlfriend on the side. And so they actually had a child together before Jane's mother died. And the day after the funeral, Jane moved to her stepmother's house. And her second day in that house was her first beating. She was beat for doing absolutely nothing. She was beat for looking the wrong way. But worse than that, she was told she was ugly, stupid, useless, worthless. Nobody loved her, and no one ever would. And that was really, really tough. The beating and the misuse and abuse continued. One day, her stepmother was mad, and she flicked her cigarette at little Jane. and Jane lost the vision in one of her eyes. She would get beat for wearing blue socks instead of brown socks. She would be beat over and over again, knocked unconscious, and never taken to a hospital. One day, her stepmother got mad and hit her in the mouth and knocked out her front teeth, and then took her to the dentist and said she had fallen out of bed. That was really, really embarrassing for an almost teenage little girl. And then one day when Jane was about 13, she was being beat by one of the other children in the house with a broomstick. Whack, whack, whack. And she laid there and she started saying, "Stop, don't, please." And then she said, "Cut it out or I'll tell my dad." Well, that's when her stepmother started to laugh. You know the kind of laugh where you're holding your sides, you're laughing so hard? And that is when she said, "You don't have a dad. You were adopted." Whoa. That was really tough. Really rough. And at that moment, Jane knew that her mom would never come to rescue her. And that was when she decided to take her life. She got everything together, was all ready to end the horrid life that she was living. But before she did, she put towels over her lap and on the floor and on the bed. She was sitting on the edge of her bed because she was thinking, if I make a mess, my stepmother's going to get really mad. So she was sitting there and kind of saying, "Goodbye, cruel world." And a couple of things came to mind. She had been raised Christian, and she had heard that if you killed yourself, you would go to hell. And she said, "Well, Jane, do you want an eternity of hell?" Obviously, she didn't. And the second thing was that she had just read an incredible book. And for those of you who love to read or who are able to read, you can learn such amazing things from books. And she had read the story of Harriet Tubman. Does anyone here know who Harriet Tubman was? Yes? Good, I see a few do. Well, Harriet Tubman was a slave who was in the United States, and when she was 13, the same age as little Jane, her master hit her in the head with an iron. And from that day on, she would be talking to you and just fall off asleep. However, Harriet decided that she wasn't going to take it anymore, and she escaped from slavery. You know, those of us who travel think it might be a pretty long way to travel from here to, Toronto. If you could imagine, if you are able, to walk from here to Toronto. But imagine walking or getting there by scooting or wheeling all the way to, let's say, Florida. That took a fair amount of courage. And little Jane was really impressed. Could I have some water, please? Someone? Thank you. And as little Jane was sitting on the edge of her bed, about to take her life, thank you, she said, "If Harriet Tubman could escape from slavery, I can escape from this house." 13 years old, many years ago, there was no 1-800 number, there was no child find, no advertisements about getting out of abusive situations. So she listened and read and found out how to get away from her situation. And when she turned 16, she did something that a lot of young people think is kind of funny. She was really sad to quit school. Now, I know all of you are dedicated to education, but young people often say, yeah, give me the chance. But for her, it was a really, really big thing to do. You see, at school, she could be almost like anyone else. Whereas at home, nothing she did got her anything but beating and abuse. So she got a job doing housework, and I hear that to this day she hates housework, but she did get that job, and a few weeks later she left home with nothing except the clothes on her back. She didn't have an iPod, she didn't have a teddy bear, she didn't even have a bunch of clothes to take. But worse than that, she was empty inside from physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. So she was going down the street, and she had this bright idea, and she stopped at a child agency, and she said, I'm 16 years old, can I leave home legally? Why might she want to know that? Any idea? Why would she want to know?
Because otherwise she'd have to go back.
You got that right. So it was a Friday afternoon, and the children's agency, for about 4 or 5 hours, asked her name, her address, and why she wanted to leave home. Excuse me, not her address, her phone number. Name, phone number, why do you want to leave home? Name, phone number, why do you want to leave home? Over and over again. And finally, she gave her phone number. And what do you think they did? They called home, and she was sitting way across the room, and she could hear her stepmother, you get that four-letter word home. I'll teach her to run away from home. Well, they kind of got the message that she couldn't go home, but they had no place to put her. Friday afternoon, this kid comes out of nowhere, wants help, so they put her in what was known as a home for wayward girls, with bars on the windows and locks on the doors. And there was a young woman in there who had committed armed robbery. There were hookers, drug dealers, and then there was Jane, whose only crime was trying to get away from abuse. Well, it took about 3 or 4 weeks, and a family took her in, and they had 8 children of their own, which means they were pretty amazing to take in this kid. But you know, things didn't work out. She had no social skills of living in a family, because at home she had lived in an attic. She was not allowed downstairs with the rest of the family. She lived in an attic. So she didn't know that kids tease each other and the conversation that goes on at a kitchen table. She spent a lot of time in her room, in the solitude of a small place. She went to another home, and that didn't work. So then she went and lived at the Y, and she went back to school. And she had to get her own self up on those awful February mornings with snow and nastiness, but she did, and she went to school. And then one day, a year or so later, she was at this dance, and this drop-dead gorgeous guy walked in. And he told her that he fell in love with her the moment he saw her. I find that a bit hard to believe, but that's what he claims. And they did fall in love, and they got married, and they raised 3 sons. However, she was not able to hold her sons or to hug her sons because it hadn't been done to her. But she continued getting education. She continued being active and became a leader in her community. And then one day, she was driving along, minding her own business, and a drunk driver went through a stop sign. Why would I tell a story like that? Why would I share my personal pain? Why would I do it with a group such as those who are here today? One of the reasons, life is tough. It can be really, really tough. But you know what? We can make it. And I see future leaders in this room. I see young people who, no matter what the challenge, no matter what the barrier, no matter what life has delivered them, they are going to school, they are becoming more educated, and they're here tonight. They're at a conference where they can learn how to write resumes, how to be prepared for job interviews, how to be ahead of the game by knowing science and technology, knowing all about the written word and how to access it. And if that isn't what makes the leaders of tomorrow, I really don't know what does. You are all amazing, and you're here. You're not watching TV. You're not playing some electronic game. You're here. When I knew that I was going to be speaking to a group of young people who are looking to be the future leaders, I did a little bit of research, and the unemployment rate of women who have disabilities is over 60%. The median income for women with disabilities is $8,360. Not much money to live on. Men, it's a little over $19,000, and I don't recall what the median is for people who don't have disabilities, but it's a whole lot more than that. So are you wise, are you smart to be getting your education? You better believe it. The rates of poverty for people who have children with disabilities is 5 times greater than that of the rest of Canada. Wow, what does that tell us? We don't honor, we don't respect, we don't value very, very important people in our society. People who can carry us into the next generation. There are almost 5 million people, about 20% of the population, who have self-identified as having disabilities. That made me think, okay, so how many of them are in school? And I had a really tough time finding those statistics. And you know, people with disabilities are studied to death. But people are not studying where you are in the education system. And the statistics that I did find were a few years old, and they really threw me for a loop. 8% of post-secondary schools in Canada say they have no special programs for people with disabilities. That's pretty outrageous. Overall, and again, these stats were a bit old, there was only 2% of students who were using services because they said they had a disability. Interestingly, community colleges had an awful lot more students than universities. Now, it seems to me I know a few people, and I even met one this evening, who was told by a guidance counselor that they just need forget university or college. So I'll bet a whole bunch of young people with disabilities are being streamed into community college rather than university. Nothing wrong with community college if that's what you want. But don't stop there, and don't stop at secondary school because people tell you you can't do it. Whether it's a visible disability or a non-visible disability, whatever the range of disability, those of you in this room are proving that y'all can make it. And I feel extremely proud to know you all, to have seen you all, met some of you. Another very interesting piece of information is that the province of Quebec has the least number of students who have self-identified as having disabilities. And there is some belief that the fact that they don't consider learning disabilities to be disabilities may have something to do with it. And it's rather interesting that they should be so much further behind. They have about a 2/3% of people with disabilities versus 6% in some provinces. I pulled out a whole bunch of human rights, federal court, and Supreme Court decisions, thinking that y'all might want to know some of those, but I'm not going to go through them all. But I did find that there were some incredible situations that have gone on which have resulted in people having to make a human rights claim, and then possibly having to take that human rights claim to the federal court, and maybe even to the Supreme Court, which could take 10, 12 years. And there were times when young people, there was an 11-year-old girl who was denied access to a school because she had mild cerebral palsy, but it was a private school that said it could choose whatever students would go there. And she passed all the tests, but at an open house, someone noticed that she had CP, and she was refused entrance. Can you believe that? Not that many years ago. And she appealed, and she won, and then the school board appealed the decision that said she was being discriminated against. And then they finally had to be told, sure, you can have some discriminatory practices, but you have to prove that those practices have a purpose. And the fact that it was a private school with high academic standing and even a good physical education program were not good enough reasons to keep a young woman out of that school. But by that time, she was no longer 11 years old. There are so many other cases of young people, not so young people, in Canada who have been terribly discriminated against. One that comes to mind was a secretary in a secondary, either an elementary or secondary school. And she was Aboriginal, and they had a special school project that was studying First Nations heritage background. And so she, being of that culture, did a really interesting presentation, and she talked about spirituality and some of the things that First Nation people believe in, and the school decided that she was mentally ill. And then they really pressed her and pressed her and pressed her and tried to get her to quit. And so she admitted that she was feeling stress and anxiety, and they literally called her crazy. And they went to court to keep her from her job, and whatever the result was, and I can't recall it verbatim, but in the decision it said that the school had no business calling this woman crazy based on some assumption that they had come up with. How many times do people make assumptions about people's mental health based on things that they don't even know about? How many people are judged in their workplace and in the community based on what myths we all have about mental health? You're the future leaders. You're the ones that need to take a stand and make sure that these type of things stop. I was going to speak a little bit about the duty to accommodate and undue hardship and then risk. But again, you're being very good, and I'm not hearing any snoring, but I don't want to push it. I just want to mention that duty to accommodate is the law of the land, and schools and places of employment have a duty to accommodate. And they're going to come back and say, well, no, it's going to cause undue hardship. The decision has been made that undue hardship cannot just be something financial, and we know that accommodations don't cost all that much. Often it's just the accommodation of a person's attitude, or the school's attitude, or an employer's attitude. But it has to be much, much more than just saying, oh no, it's going to cost me too much. There has to be really solid evidence. And there have not been any or many cases where people have been able to prove undue hardship. So companies and education bodies have come back with yet another little task, and that is risk. And we have heard at the commission and certainly in the courts that having that person with a disability in this place is going to cause people to be at risk. So that's one of the new things you're going to hear. But fortunately, the courts have also said that that has to have solid evidence. And the evidence that has been led on many occasions is, oh, well, it really affects the morale of the rest of the staff. It affects the morale of the other students who aren't getting special assistance. Anyone heard that? I have a very, very dear friend who has a very severe learning disability, and she is currently working on her PhD. And she speaks so eloquently about the struggle her parents had getting her through high school, fighting for her day after day after day. And a little aside here, when I was a school trustee a gazillion years ago, Bill 82 came out, which was the bill in Ontario that integrated children who had disabilities. And I chaired that task force, and that was before that drunk driver got a hold of me. So my interest in people with disabilities and my interest in keeping people from being oppressed has been long, long before the 20-some-odd years I've been sitting in this chair. But one of the things that she talks about is how as she got better and better at university, got her degree, got her master's, now working on her PhD, people are just saying, no, 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 you can't have a disability. Like, look at how much you've accomplished. Can you believe that? And it's really interesting in the job market. People tell me so often that the rest of the team have really low morale because they have to carry too much of a load because somebody with a disability is being accommodated. And that is a whole lot of bunk. And I'm so very, very pleased that the courts have decided that absolutely correct. It can't just be that your staff morale is down. You better have some pretty concrete evidence that having that person with a disability in your workforce, anywhere, and they do this with mental health a great, great deal. Oh my goodness, we don't know if she's going to have an episode, and everybody will be at risk. Double bunk. You know, there are so many people who have the full range of mental wellness or mental illness, from anxiety to depression to everything else. And all of those individuals are not a risk to be around. Interestingly, the big myth is that people with mental illness are violent and you better look out for them, but they are far more likely to be the victims of violence. So we all have to be out there talking about spreading the word and ensuring that the rest of Canada knows how much value we have, how much value everyone in this room has. Oh, there was a student at Memorial University. Is that in Nova Scotia? Newfoundland. Okay, I knew it was on the East Coast. I just have to mention this. This student was in a doctoral course, and he stuttered. And if you can believe this, the other doctors in his program harassed him, made jokes, made comments about the manner in which he spoke. And he took a human rights claim forward. Can you believe that? And he won, but again, it was way, way too long. And the school and those individuals who had been harassing him said that what they were saying had to do with the quality of his work. Again, we can't let people get away with those things. Have you all heard of the Neorin decision? If you haven't, it's a decision that you may want to learn about. That is probably the watershed for duty to accommodate. And unfortunately, I was unable to get all of these cases onto your little USB. But if any of you are interested in these cases, and I have to thank the staff at the Canadian Human Rights Commission for doing some of the research for me. The research is done with very interesting cases. If any of you want them, I'll supply them to the staff of Needs, and you can have them. Because actually they're a good read. A little difficult at times, but usually the crux of it is at the top and tells you, so that you as leaders can be standing up and stepping forth and scooting forth and wheeling forth to help Canada see that no type of discrimination can be allowed. And I want to talk just a little teeny bit about prevention, and that's where all of us in this room come into play. We need to be preventing human rights claimants from having to come forth, because it takes so very much out of a person. financially, spiritually, emotionally, time-wise. So let's keep the rest of Canada aware that you cannot step on us because it's against the law. And I'd like to speak to caregivers in this room. There are times when it feels as if the caregivers and we people who have disabilities are at odds, when indeed we ought to be united, we ought to be fighting together. And I've worked with caregivers around anti-racism, around anti-oppression, and a good number of you are experiencing oppression and racism and all of those isms. But that doesn't mean that you cannot be united with us. And people say, well, you know, I can't complain against my company. I see things aren't going well. But you know, you have a voice. You can speak to your alderman. You can speak to your city councillor. You can speak to your MPP, to MPs, write letters. As an organization, take a stand when some of the cutbacks are going on that actually, I believe, put some of us at risk. So let's fight this together. And I know y'all are worked far too hard for very, very little remuneration. And I can say that I cherish and value every ounce that is given to me by caregivers. And thank you so very much. Absolutely, for all of you. It's okay. I'm not finished yet. Good stuff. For all of us who can't stand, we thank you for that. And I once again want to say, and I'm not just saying it, you are the leaders of tomorrow. I have spent way over 30 years, Margaret said over 30 years, I won't even tell you how many decades, fighting these fights, battling these battles, and I haven't even had time this evening to talk about intersectionality. Those of us who are people who have disabilities, and yet we are people of color, and yet we may be oppressed women, and yet we may be single parents, and all of that stuff which makes the fight, the every single day fight, much harder, much tougher, and so much harder to bear. Another time I'll talk to you about that. But you are the leaders. Just being here tells me that. And I truly want to commend Needs. I believe you've been in existence for 22 years, something like that. I believe we would not have the number of people in post-secondary education without you. Not a doubt in my mind. The type of support, the type of extra education, the type of networking that you allow people to have not only lets them get into school, but lets them stay there and lets them graduate and lets them go back for yet another degree and another degree. That's also very interestingly. Some universities have said they will give accommodation for your first degree, but they won't give it for a second or a third. And that too has been challenged and has been upset. So if any of you get any problems because you're going on to second and third degrees, that too is a lot of bunk. I'm going to ask, is it Chris? To start revving up the way that I'm going to end things this evening. I would ask all of you to reflect. Take a little bit of time for reflection this evening. And I find that music often allows me to reflect. And so I've brought, both music and poetry allow me to reflect. I've brought a piece of music that has its poetic words that allows me to reflect and think about how much worth I am to this world. And it talks about love. I would like you to think about the love that's spoken of in this piece of music as self-love. Loving yourself, respecting yourself, and therefore being able to be the very best that you can be. So please enjoy this piece of music. Thank you so very much for having me here this evening, and I hope that it's ready to go.